This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
Good morning, Darin Curtis from Menlo Security.
Today, we're going to talk about isolation technology. Hit the music, Claude.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we have Darin Curtis, Vice President, Public Sector at Menlo Security, and we're going to talk about cybersecurity and browser isolation and many different aspects of securing the federal government. But Darin, before we begin, maybe give us a thumbnail sketch of Menlo and how you fit in this whole discussion, please.
Sure. Menlo Security, about 9-10 years old company. We focus on security a different way. It's probably the easiest way to do it. We're using isolation technology to help prevent attacks instead of responding to attacks.
An ounce of prevention, pound of cure. We know that one, don't we?
We do.
So Menlo Park, California, I assume it's a Silicon Valley company, been around for 10 years. Is that right?
Been around 10 years, not far from Menlo Park. We're in Mountain View, California's headquarters.
Good. I go to LA all the time. I don't get that far north in California at all. So I went to your website, and I see this big fancy acronym called HEAT. And I remember those gangster movies from the 1930s. You're packing heat, you know. So what is HEAT all about? I thought this is a browser for isolated browser. So what is HEAT anyway?
Well, it's a good question. And we need another acronym for the government. So we decided to add HEAT but highly evasive adaptive threats, which is another reason why it's an acronym, because that's a mouthful to speak to. It's more about what we're trying to draw attention to, which is bad actors are getting away with doing a lot of things very creatively, and they're working much faster than what our security technology can keep up with. So what we're trying to do is say, you've got potentially legitimate looking threats getting through your existing security stack. And we believe you need isolation to go from responding to preventing. And the only way you can do that is preventing code and other forms of the threats where they're getting through to the device or to the agency network.
I've been doing this for many years, Darin. Back when you're in high school, I was in the NPR answering questions, and I'd answer questions about PDFs, you know. And for PDFs for decades had this sacrosanct, impenetrable, never get in, no problem at all. And all of a sudden, the last few years, something as most people think is as secure as a PDF can be compromised, and other graphic images can be compromised. And so people can let down their guard and bring in a PDF, and all of a sudden that is a highly evasive adaptive technique, doing something that everyone trusts, isn't it? That's
exactly right. The phrase zero trust really needs to adhere to zero, as in never trust. We know zero trust is something that we're all hearing about in the government, particularly with the mandate from the executive order. But it's critical that you focus on how do you never trust. And never trust includes never trusting even that PDF, which could be trustworthy.
So I was at your website reading some blogs this morning, and I read a phrase. I haven't heard this phrase before: dynamically generating logos. I mean, now this is awful creative, isn't it? I mean, and if I saw a logo from a sports organization and, oh yeah, here's my tickets, have to click on it. And so what malicious actors are doing is they're dynamically creating logos that are very similar to a standard logo, and people are clicking on them on phishing email, aren't they?
Yeah, they sure are. And it's a great example of what an evasive adaptive threat really is. You can also think of an HTML smuggling campaign, which is using legitimate looking encoded malware that is getting through because it looks like common HTML. What you need to do is prevent that from ever getting through directly to the user or the agency network.
I interviewed a person from a rather large company, and this person said that they never answer email because they're on Slack. Slack's great. And so we got Darin Curtis saying, oh boy, I would take and exploit the Slack channel. And so, I'm going to avoid all that phishing by going to Slack. But this is another attack channel, isn't it?
It is. SMS, text, it's a very common phishing angle. And if you look at the Octopus campaign, the phishing campaign from Octopus, they're trying to gather people's credentialed multi-factor authentication data and be able to legitimately log in with stolen credentials and access company, crown jewels, shall we say.
I was an English teacher for a year, so I have to spell things out. So this is OKTAPUS, and the big wordplay is a company called Okta, which handles identification. And so they penetrated some Okta code, or what happened with this octopus?
Well, it's a good question, and we're big fans of Okta. Multi-factor authentication is a critical piece to good security. But what they're doing is not penetrating Okta. What they're doing is using a phishing campaign for a user to gather their credentials unknowingly and showing a fake Okta website. And then what they're using is those credentials that they've stolen to actually access the company from there.
So some people call this technology an RBI technology, remote browser isolation. I keep thinking of the World Series because I'm looking at RBIs now and Bryce Harper, RBIs and Bryce Harper and what's going on in Philadelphia here. So what is the biggest challenge in deploying something like this? I mean, what's the biggest challenge that Menlo has in working with federal agencies to deploy this RBI?
Well, I think that from a challenge perspective, it's one, understanding what isolation technology can do for you. And it's not necessarily a rip and replace technology. It's an enhancement to what they already have, where you're increasing the security posture by adding isolation to perhaps an existing secure web gateway or next-gen firewall or a WAF. What we're trying to do is never allow code to be directly downloaded to the user's machine or the network.
I have heard serious debates about WAFs, web application firewall.
Web application firewall.
Yeah, I've heard security guys just throw chairs and yell and scream at each other over this. I mean, really, it's like, get out of the room. This is a big debate, isn't it?
It is a debate, and it's an important piece of technology, but it's not the be all end all. What you're trying to do is secure the application. Is really what that gets down to.
Last night, I was rereading a book called Start With Why by Simon Sinek. And so I always tell my students to start with why. But I want to make a transition to who. I want to start with who. So who uses Menlo Security in the federal government now?
Good question. Department of Energy is a client, as well as the Department of Defense. And we are deploying worldwide for the Department of Defense right now for all of their users across the world.
So it might seamlessly fit into this stack of applications or stack of products, huh?
That's exactly right. I mean, obviously, the DoD is not ripping out all of their very good security technology and assuming Menlo is going to be the answer for everything. There's still a whole lot that we need to integrate with, and that's a critical piece to the puzzle. And
integration is not just a technical term. It's also I guess it's a solutions term where Menlo Park would integrate and work with other companies in order to combine on a solution for something as massive as some DoD project. Is that right? Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there may be companies that do a certain piece of security extremely well, and Menlo is best in class in isolation. So why not combine the two rather than try to get one from everyone or everything from one, where it may not be the best solution available. So a couple nights ago, it was kind of cool sitting on the deck, and we got out the heater for the deck. We turned it on, and I put my hand up there to see how hot it was, and it was pretty comfortable for a nice evening in the fall in the Blue Ridge. And so that's how I check my heat. So how can customers in the federal government check their heat, HEAT, in your situation? Well, we actually just came out with a tool called Heat Check. It's a free tool that we're offering. Think of it as a advanced penetration testing tool for the web browser or the browser, where you can actually apply it to your network and see whether a certain piece of we'll call it malware, but HTML smuggling, we have pieces that are vanilla. They're not dangerous to the network, but we can show whether they get through or not. It's kind of like a penetration test, a browser penetration test, huh? That's exactly right. And it's free to use. We want everyone to see what vulnerabilities potentially they have, because it's an important way to secure the federal government. MenloSecurity.com for that piece of free software. I was there this morning, and there's another great report, and I have to tell my listeners about this. It's called 2022 Impacts, Ransomware Attacks and Preparedness, and this applies to the federal government. If you want to learn more, you can go to resources.menlosecurity.com and download it. But this is the curveball for me. I always thought phishing attacks were like for Darrin's Donuts in Chicago or John Lee Pizza Store in Dallas or something. But phishing attacks are going after federal agencies like the DIH, huh?
They are. They're trying to shut down and grab data and use it for ransom. And what we're suggesting is prevent them from ever getting in by eliminating the weakest link in the security chain, which is the person. There will always be the weakest link. They'll click on something either inadvertently or intentionally, and it's going to cause a problem. So if we can eliminate that as a threat vector and literally eliminate ransomware from the federal government, that's a win.
I spent 10 minutes this morning trying to develop a headline for this interview, and I came up with everything and played this and that and RBIs and baseball and all kinds of fun things. But I came up with a phrase, weaponized files. so that's what the PDF used to be the safest thing in the world, rock solid. Now it is a weaponized file, huh? I think that's a good title for this interview.
That is a great title. And it speaks to what I spoke to someone in the DoD a while ago, and they coined the phrase that I've continued to use, which is, if the file is weaponized, it detonates in the cloud rather than on our agency network. And I was thinking, that's brilliant. I like the DoD angle where it's detonating, and I like that it's a weaponized file, but it's detonating in the cloud away from the person's machine or the agency network.
Darrin, we got to hire a cartoonist to come up with a cartoon for social media to describe what this interview is. Here's the half-hour interview summarized in a cartoon. That would be good. Well, I guess this speaks to the next quote I'm going to use. And this quote says, ransomware is one of the biggest single threats to government networks. Really? 5 years ago, it wasn't. Was it COVID or what precipitated all this attack on the government, especially with phishing?
Well, COVID, I think hackers had some more time on their hands to get better at what they're doing. But ransomware and government, it's not just the federal government. You've seen recent attacks on school systems, in banking, in county, state agencies as well. They're finding a weak link and they're exploiting it. And that's really the challenge, that you need to close that weak link by preventing it from happening in the first place. And that's what we're trying to do. But it's definitely an issue that's growing and it'll continue to grow.
So let's say I'm going to a Red Hat event next week, face to face. I'm trying to do once every couple of months now. And let's say you're there with me and someone walks up to you and they go, "Oh, Menlo, what do people get mostly confused about? What do they classify it differently? What do they think about Menlo Security? What do you always have to say? No, it's Menlo Park, California. What do you have to say to correct people when they have these assumptions about Menlo Security?"
Well, usually, of course, there's the West Coast Silicon Valley angle that we have to just describe where we are, but we have to describe what we do. Isolation technology is a new way of thinking for security. Detect and remediate, or responding after the bad guy is in your network, it's not working. And that's why we're seeing a growing threat in security. And what we need to tell people in this instance is how isolation prevents things from happening in the first place. And you need to start thinking of security as a prevention strategy rather than a detect and respond strategy, sort of like locking the front door rather than letting a bad guy in and then hoping you chase him out.
So there are other companies that obviously do this isolation technology. So why is Menlo better, and what's the magic sauce that Menlo has that the other companies don't?
Really good question. Probably better designed for a technical person who could give you the details of that. But in a nutshell, what we do is we don't video stream the web or the internet back to the user. That is a bandwidth hog. And it also is not high definition. You have a hard time scaling that type of technology. What we do is called DOM mirroring, document object modeling. And what that is literally providing a rendered image of the internet that you can freely interact with. But if you accidentally click on something that seems good, but isn't good, that malware will detonate in the cloud. And the other great thing is once you close the tab in that browser, you close the session. We have a disposable container that's holding that session. We throw away that container.
When I was thinking about these threats, I was thinking about a previous interview I did, episode 28, with a company that you may know of called SpyCloud. I interviewed Joel Bagnall. He worked at very high levels in the federal government. He has access to a lot. I did a half-hour interview, and he couldn't talk about half the things I want to talk about. So if you want to hear a different perspective on this and hear a guy who's really at the top of his game, listen to Joe and I's conversation for episode 28 of Federal Tech Podcast. Have you ever met Joe?
I've never met Joe. I've heard of SpyCloud, but there's a lot of great technology coming out of some of the areas of the government that we just don't know about until years later.
Well, the podcast I want to do with him is like a podcast from a whiskey bar where there's no one recording anything. He says, okay, this is really what's going on. I think that we could run for the hills after that conversation. So, are there specific target agencies that would deploy this easier than others? Would a civilian agency be able to deploy this quicker than a three-letter agency, or maybe than the military agency? Or are there sweet spots for your technology in the federal government?
Well, it's really available to anyone in the federal government. We have our impact level certification from the DoD. We'll have our FedRAMP authorization in the next week or two. Don't quote me on that. It's a dependency, obviously, on the FedRAMP PMO completing their process. But we've completed everything we need to. The thing we have that's a bit of a nuance, but may speak to the three-letter agencies and others, is we also have software that can provide the same thing if you're looking at a hybrid cloud environment where you need to go on premises versus giving access to the public internet.
Menlo Security's got a strong presence all over the world, actually. And so I imagine you have meetings where you keep up with threats. So in the last 6 months, what kind of new threat technology have you been informed of at Menlo that maybe our listeners don't know about?
Well, that's really what the Highly Evasive Adaptive Threat acronym HEAT is trying to bring to light, is the ongoing new threats that are being developed using legitimate code or a legitimate pathway to your network or to your device. And it's being encoded and essentially snuck in to a user unknowingly. And that's what we're trying to draw attention to, is that this is an ongoing thing. Hackers are getting smarter. They're getting more creative. They have to, and they're trying to evade what the current technology can identify.
I was saying about these dynamically generated logos, and when I was researching this morning, I found that the number one logo that's used in phishing is DHL. And I have a daughter living in rural Africa, so I can send through DHL, so we can get there. Wow, it could be me. I could be getting an email from DHL saying your package didn't arrive in Ethiopia or something like that. So this DHL. So what happens is Darrin sends a package to his daughter in Wyoming, and he gets a note back from DHL, only it's not DHL. It's a weaponized file that's doing impersonating DHL. And you go, well, I want to get this to my, bang, you're gone, huh?
Yep.
I mean, and what you're saying is this is not limited to just to you and I and our friends here in Northern Virginia. They go after schools and hospitals. This is the most nefarious of it all. They're going after hospitals and locking down hospitals with this phishing attack.
They are, and they're using it as a weapon against, the administration, who they think has deep pockets to pay to get their data back.
Yeah. And I think that's a dilemma everybody has to say, whether or not they pay the ransom or not. I think a commercial organization may have some options, but really in the federal government, if you're going to comply with some of the zero trust initiatives that are out there, you have to come up with a solution like some kind of isolation browser solution that can be deployed easily and have flexibility. Because I think if we learned anything since COVID is that you have to have flexibility for scaling activities. And if your isolation technology can't scale, well, then you're going to be stuck. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? Birds and cats falling from the sky, and everyone has to work out of their house again. And there may have scaling requirements there that would prevent, it might allow malicious code to come in because so much it couldn't handle.
Yeah, and it becomes a customer experience at that point, John. And I think where that starts to break down is, to your point, things start to get through, usually because the IT shop is forced to allow exceptions to get through. So they're going to bypass the isolation technology because they have to in order to keep their customers happy. And what we're doing is a different technology that can scale. And because we are not allowing images or the files to actually be downloaded, they're looking at them. And if you think about it, about 75% of the time, I know I don't download the file. I look at it, I read the PDF, and then I close the session. I don't need it. So if you need to, we'll do a scan on those types of files, but most of the time you don't need to. So save the bandwidth, save the time, improve the customer experience while literally eliminating the phishing and ransomware attacks.
Oh, good. Well, Darrin, unfortunately here we're running out of time. This has been a great discussion about weaponized files and about, I think the aspect of scaling has to be in everyone's plans for the next 5 years. I was going to ask you about the next 5 years, but you have to be in the next 5 years because you have to plan for expansion. You have to plan for, I don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 years, but if you have a basic system that can scale and grow, then you're going to be in a safe position when the next major attack occurs.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, we are all over the world, and part of that is you think of the onset of edge computing. You want to be closest to the person using the browser. So we've set up shop all over the world in order to be closest to the users. Our FedRAMP, of course, will be east-west in the U.S., but it's critical to be close to the user to improve the latency, to improve the customer experience.
Great. You've been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Darin Curtis, Vice President, Public Sector at Menlo Security. Thank you, Darrin.
John, thank you. Really appreciate it. That was fun.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.